Welcome to the Journal of the Southwest Radio Hour, produced by the University of Arizona Southwest Center. I'm Jeff Bannister. Today we're speaking with Dr. Raquel Rubio-Goldsmith, co-director of the Binational Migration Institute in the University of Arizona's Department of Mexican American Studies. Dr. Rubio-Goldsmith taught history at Pima Community College from 1969 until 1999, when she retired from that post. If there is indeed a line between Raquel's research and civic engagement, it is extremely fuzzy at best. Since the late 1960s, she has worked on a diversity of immigrant rights initiatives in Tucson and the greater Southwest, and she has led numerous community-based research projects focused on the effects of U.S. immigration and border enforcement policies on Mexicano and Latino communities. Raquel makes me proud to call Tucson my home. Well, Raquel, welcome to Journal of the Southwest Radio Hour.
Gracias. Thank you for inviting me.
It's a pleasure to have you. So I was thinking about a conversation that we had many years ago. We were at Big Jim Griffith's summer party,
Right.
the Club Pimalteño summer party. And you were telling me about your childhood in and around Douglas, and then ultimately how you ended up at the National Autonomous University, UNAM, in Mexico City. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that experience.
Yes, well, it's always good to remember, and maybe I remember it differently each time. Different things pop up. But my parents are both not from Arizona. They were both what one could call the result of the Mexican Revolution. Both of their families were totally uprooted. And so as young people, they ended up in Douglas. My father's family was from the Sierra of Chihuahua. And so it's about 1912, actually, with the year he was born. My grandmother had to leave because her husband had been killed. We never knew whether he was on the side of Pancho Villa or on the side of the people against him. You know, my grandmother never talked about the revolution. She never talked about Mexico. And so she left. She was pregnant with my father. She had two other children. Went to El Paso to live with a sister she had there who had married a man from El Paso. And so he ended up in Douglas. They needed domestic labor there. There were a lot of lone men, you know, the whole thing that happens with these mining towns at that time, with a lot of single men coming in or men without their families. And so she was a seamstress and made her living that way. So my father grew up there. He went through the 8th grade and then stopped so that she could stop working, and he supported her. And my mother, both of her parents are norteños. That is, her grandfather on her father's side was from Monterrey. Mm-hmm. He became a lawyer, went to Mexico City, and ended up as a district judge. He was sent to Mulegé, California to do some cases, met a young woman there and married her. So my mother had like Mulegé and Monterrey, you know, all kind of mixed together. And then later, her mother was from Cocospera, Sonora. It's a long story. But anyway, we're a real norteño family. My parents were both brought up by very norteños. So our household was very much geared to the norteño culture. My father's mother lived with us all my life. She was there and was a very strong presence in the household, which were things like, you know, girls can't wear pants, girls can't skate, girls can't go swimming, girls can't ride bikes. She had ridden horses, you know, but it was like, que dirá la gente all the time. And my mother was much different. She wanted us to learn how to swim and skate and ride our bikes and go out. She was very modern in that way. So there was always a tension in that. And then I remember on our block, there were the Langford family, which has just recently come up in the news. The Langford family was a Mormon family that went constantly to Mexico because Mr. Langford had another family there. And the summer he'd take all his 12 children and they'd go spend the summer in Mexico. But it was that one Mormon family, and then there was a Mexican-American Lutheran family. And so we would have religious wars on our block because the real truth was Catholic. No, the real truth was Lutheran. No, the real truth was the Book of Mormon. And we were all kind of the same age, and we would just fight and fight. And then the next day we'd be best friends, you know, we'd skate and play jacks and do all those kinds of things together. So it was an exciting childhood. And 2 blocks east of my house was Clawson Elementary School. And 2 blocks west of my house was 7th Street School Elementary. And the 7th Street was for Mexican children, and Clawson was for Anglo children. And so here my good friend Langford went to Clawson, and then there was a family there whose grandmothers were both Mexican, but they had married American engineers. And so their last name was Davis. And so they went to Clawson. And they were such good friends. And I'd go to 7th Street. And so that was the first time that I really understood that there was a big difference. It was like my very best friends, in a way, could not go to the same school that I went to. And yet our block was very integrated, but we had always all played together. And so that really kind of taught me a heavy lesson. I didn't understand exactly, but then I started understanding that my father would tell us, for example, well, don't go over to 10th Street, just go to the church. Immaculate Conception was on 10th Street. And the town was really segregated racially. And 10th Street, already 6th Street was kind of the end, but as you got to 10th Street, there were just fewer Mexicans. And after 10th Street, there weren't any Mexicans. Up until you got to 15th Street, then those streets up there were Mexicans. So you had to kind of keep an eye, not that anybody would beat you up or anything. For boys, it was that way. Boys would get into fights. But for the girls, well, we just kind of stay out of the way, you know, not get in the way. And so I went to Loretto School, which was on 14th Street. So I used to have to walk and go through neighborhoods that were all Anglo. And so I can remember my mother saying, we just have to be very careful. Walk in the middle of the street because it was avenues. And so don't walk close to the street so you don't get into trouble with a dog or step on somebody's plants or, you know. So it was always...
Don't walk close to the houses.
Don't walk close to the houses. Walk in the middle of the street. And they weren't... At that time, the avenues were not paved. So you'd walk in the middle of the street and you're... Douglas has really strong winds. And I can remember the little rocks hitting my legs. The wind would be so strong because of the dust that would raise up and the tumbleweeds, you know, rolling down the streets.
I've had that experience in Douglas and Agua Prieta. The wind
The wind is really
there.
strong. And but then at some point my father got me a bike. Oh, that was so glorious to have a bike. It was a secondhand bike. It had chrome fenders. Can you believe chrome fenders? Everybody, it was everybody's envy because I had chrome fenders on my bike. And I could ride my bike to school, so that was much better because we'd come home for lunch. There wasn't a cafeteria. And I hated taking lunch, so I'd come home for lunch and run home, run back. And then later that would happen with going to high school, which was even further. That was on 15th Street. So...
Were you, and by the time you arrived in high school, were you all back together again, or
yeah,
still segregated?
it was integrated then. But integration is a funny word to use in that way, because there was a school that was just for black children. It was over like on 4th or 5th Street and 8th Avenue. And there weren't many black families, African-American families, and they had grades 1 through 8. And after the 8th grade, they couldn't go to high school.
Wow.
But they integrated it because there was a real good football player, Joe Lewis. And so the year I went into high school. It was a senior high school because they had 7th, 8th, and 9th grade in the junior high, and then 10, 11, and 12 in the senior high. And so I went into the 10th grade. When I went into the 10th grade, he had been there a year, I think, on the football team already. But it caused a lot of problems because even if Douglas had taken him in, and I don't remember any other African-American student there while I was there. There may have been, but I don't remember anyone. They'd go to El Paso to play. Well, he couldn't play because El Paso wouldn't let him play. He'd go to Safford. There were places he'd go, but they wouldn't let him play. So it was like a strange kind of integration. This was before Brown. This was like I was there I graduated in 52, so that was to have been like 49, 50. So that was before Brown versus. So anyway, but all through school, we were segregated in different ways. For example, if you got out of elementary school, then you went into middle school. The middle school was integrated, but not the sections. Like there would be section 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and section 1, 2, and 3 would be Anglo, and 4 and 5 would be the Mexican sections. So you might run into each other on the playground, but you didn't have class with anybody.
Wow.
And then, but by junior high, that had kind of broken down. It was still very divided, but not quite as much as it had been. It had been definite before. And in high school, I have to tell you, I hated high school.
Hear, hear.
I hated it. The only good memory I have of high school is being in the band. And that was a wonderful experience. I had taken music. The head of the music department for the whole school was a man by the name of Mr. Udke. He was a wonderful, gentle, loving person, probably from Minnesota or somewhere, and just always had a smile on his face. But he could be very stern. But he was in charge of the band, the high school orchestra, and the music programs. So when I was in middle school, he started a program to start people on orchestras in the middle school so that he would have people in high school, right?
Yeah, smart.
Because the orchestra was not an easy thing for people to do. So they started a program where you could take violin, and I wanted to take violin. So I signed up, and it turned out that violin was taught during my spelling class. So, and this is an image I will never forget. My mother, who was very, very pregnant at that time with one of my brothers. I'm the eldest of 9. She wanted, if I wanted to take violin, she wanted me to take it. And she was always very concerned with our schooling. And so she went to see Mr. Carlson, who was the principal of the, not Mr. Carlson, Mr. Spencer. Mr. Spencer was the principal of the middle school. And she went to see him to talk to him about changing my class around, which would mean that I would take spelling with an Anglo class, because one of the Anglo sections had a study hall during the violin time. If they changed my section, then I could take violin and not miss my spelling class. So I remember her sitting outside his office, where the secretary was. There was a glass division with a hallway, so I could see her sitting in there waiting to see him. And every time we go out of class and come out of recess, whatever, she was still sitting there.
Still there, huh?
She was still there. She was still there. And so then when I went home for lunch, she had just gotten there to have lunch for Dad. She had left it fixed in the morning before she left, because he came home for lunch. And she said, well, that Mr. Carlson had said no. Mr. Spencer had said no. He said, don't worry. I know the superintendent. I'm going to go see him. So a couple of days later, he went to see Mr. Carlson. And then I was called into the office to Mr. Spencer's office and told that I would not have spelling class, that I would have to do the spelling on my own if I wanted to take violin. And so, but they wouldn't change my section, see. My mother was upset, and so I didn't care. I was going to take violin, so that was good. So anyway, that was a really important thing in my academic life, because when I got to high school, and I had been involved in violin, and I loved that. I had piano lessons with the nuns, and those were the Mexican nuns, which I'll tell you about too, which is interesting. I always stayed both with the orchestra, and I, played in the secondary orchestra and then the first orchestra, because I stuck with the violin. I played it very badly, but, it was enough to be in it. And so when I got to go to high school that summer, the summer before my sophomore year, there was this announcement that came out that the high school band was looking for musicians and to go see the new director. And I thought, well, that sounds good, because the violin was, really kind of slow and stuff, and the band seemed like fun. So I went and joined in, and they had instruments. You'd rent the instrument for a very small amount. Well, it wasn't small at that time, it was a lot, but you know what I mean? You could rent the instrument. And so how I didn't know how to blow anything, and he needed someone, they needed trumpets and stuff like that. I started out with a bass saxophone, which is huge, it's so heavy.
Yeah.
But I didn't know anything else. I mean, he wanted me to do that. So I said, okay. He said, well, with a bass, you'll get started. It's an easy way to start. Okay. So all summer, I was working on the bass saxophone, and then the season started. You go out on marching band, take this heavy instrument. You're out there on the football field marching every morning. And he was just a wonderful band director, but he worked us to death. He had been in the Marine band.
Oh, wow.
He played the trombone. He was a great trombone player. But there was something else he didn't know. He didn't know that the band was not integrated. He didn't know that Mexicans weren't supposed to be in the band.
That would have been news to him, huh?
Yeah, and so he was like from, North Dakota or somewhere, right? And he had gone to the Army and, was a Marine. So he came back and he signed up all these Mexicans during the summer. And so we start playing, and it was a really integrated band, right? And so somebody called him on the carpet for it, but it was already too late. I mean, they wanted a band. And he said, well, they're all doing okay, I'll keep it under control, whatever. So we all loved it. We had a wonderful time. Yeah. And he was just he really pressed us hard. He made us work really hard. And he was very, very, he was just a very good person, right? So it was so much fun to be in the band. We'd go to El Paso with a football game, and then we'd go on parades, the rodeo parade, and we went to the...
Here in Tucson, the rodeo parade?
No, the rodeo parade in Douglas, but then we went to El Paso. No, was it Phoenix or El Paso? I think we went to the Fiesta Bowl parade. Nearly froze to death. It was so cold. But, we were going places. It was just so much fun. But we had one really experience that was very difficult. We came to Tucson when they have band day. The bands from all over the state come and they meet here at the university. And it's wonderful because we had been practicing, getting ready for what we were going to play. You go up and you have your moment, you play, and then you also play all together. Everybody would be up on the stage at the same time. So we had been looking forward to this for a long time. We came up, and they put out a schedule. You get a rehearsal moment, and then you get the moment that you play. And so we were all hanging around in our uniforms, all the bands, you had your uniforms on, your instruments and stuff, and hanging around Centennial Hall, waiting for your turn. And, well, you had to wait hours. I mean, there were tons of bands. And so a group of us were under the olive trees there on the west side. Because it was in the spring, it was pretty warm. You had these wool uniforms.
Oh, my gosh, I can't imagine.
So everybody had taken off their jackets, and we were just sitting around, hanging out, just having fun. And these young men passed by in their red uniforms and started calling us greasers and beaners. And so one of the guys in our band, Picone, he got real mad. He was a real tall guy, real dark, real tall. He played the piccolo, and he'd carry my bass saxophone for me sometimes because it was so heavy. His girlfriend would help out too. She'd help me with my bass because they felt sorry for me. But anyway, we were sitting there, and he got really angry. So he came up and yelled back at him. Then he started a fist fight. So all the guys started fighting.
Wow.
And so, of course, right away, somebody in authority came by and stopped it. So we were thrown out. We weren't allowed to compete.
Jeez.
Oh, man.
Heartbreaking.
Well, our poor director, I mean, they had spent all this money bringing us, and then we couldn't compete. He probably got in trouble, too. So I swore to God I would never come back to Tucson. I would never have anything to do with Tucson. It was the worst in the world because they were boys from Tucson High. And it was like, how could that be? How could we come to a place? It was like music was sacred, and there were like places where that shouldn't happen, and it happened. And so I thought I'd never come back. So don't ever say never.
Yeah. Look at you now.
I spent most of the years of my life in Tucson, Arizona. So,
but what an incredible story of that moment just before the big push for civil rights in the United States.
Right. That was in 1950. It was either in the fall of 51 or the spring of 52. And see, I had gone in, and I wasn't supposed to graduate. I was supposed to be a junior. I was so angry at the racism. I was just I get upset every day because I had been counseled into all these business courses, right? But I was determined I was going to go to college, and I had my mother always pushed me, and I had a teacher that I had in the second grade, Miss Woods, who always told me, you have to go to college, and she would, every time she'd see me, she'd come tell me, what are you doing to get there? So when I went in to register in high school, I told the counselor that I wanted to go to college. And he said, well, you have to take these other courses so you can get a job. And my mother had gone to high school, and so she had told me, well, it's good to learn shorthand and typing, that's a good thing to have. But I want you to do the other courses. And so we had, with a lot of struggle, arranged, and I took a course that would be college, the required courses for college entrance, plus the business school things.
The business was kind of a vocational course?
It was kind
Is
of
that
a
what they were
vocational
pushing you?
course,
Okay,
yeah.
I see.
And so I went ahead and took it, which was good. I learned shorthand and typing. And Mr. Rutke was a typing teacher, as a matter of fact. But anyway, and so I loved band. But all the rest of my courses were such, I just would get so upset about so many things. And I was doing well. I was getting good grades. That wasn't the problem. But I just was very unhappy. And then my very best friend died very suddenly. She got sick and died. And I was just, I had no friends because I had been jumping. I was much younger than all my other kids. I was 2 years ahead. And so I was like younger. At that age, it makes a big difference because they could do things I couldn't do and, all that. And my best friend had died. So I was in a bad place, and I just hated the school. So I'd go home, and I'd add up all my credits, And so one day I finally figured out I had enough credits to graduate at the end of my junior year. In 52, I wouldn't have to go the third year. I had taken so many classes.
Hallelujah.
So I go see my counselor and said, I can graduate. He looked at me and said, no, And I showed him. He looked at it and looked at it. No, you can't. You don't have a minor. Oh, I didn't know about the minor. So you had to have X number of credits for a minor. So I went home and I'd go through it over and over and over again. And then I remembered that when I was in the 8th grade, Mr. Udke had made arrangements for us to get high school credit for 8th grade orchestra because we played with a high school orchestra. So I went back there and I talked to Mr. Udke. I said, remember? He said, yes, of course, it's there somewhere. We've written down someplace. So he brought it out and I took it to the counselor, and so I had a music minor. So I always have wonderful memories about my band experience. It was just wonderful.
Wow,
yeah.
wow.
So, but then I got out of school and I couldn't get a Social Security card yet. To work, you had to be 16. I was 15. I was going to be 16 in September. And so our family doctor, Dr. Atona, was very, he knew my mother very well. He knew us all real well. And he kind of had known that that I had graduated and that I had wanted to go to college. And, of course, there was no money for it. And I had gotten a couple of little scholarships, but it wasn't going to do it. There was just no way. And so he asked me if I wanted to work. Yeah, I'd love to work. His nurse was a good friend of my mom's, and she ran his office, but it was just too much work to do the bills and be the nurse, and do all those things. So he gave me a job. It was $20 a week. I had Thursday afternoons off, Thursday and Saturday afternoons off. And I was in charge of doing the janitorial work early in the morning and then doing all the bills. That was my job. So that was really neat because in Douglas to get a job was like, and then he was willing to let me work that summer even without a Social Security number, right? Then when I got it in September, was my birthday, then we were legal, right? So I saved every penny. In the meantime, my mother said, well, you could always go to Mexico City because her family was living in Mexico City. They had been from there a long time. And one of her aunts was widowed and had no children and would often say to her, send one of the girls. So my mother wrote to her and said, well, Raquel wants to go to university. Do you think she could go there for a year? She wants to be a translator at the UN. That was my goal, to be a translator at the UN. That was so exciting. You'd go to New York, you'd go see the world and translate it. I knew Spanish and English, so I'd go learn some French maybe or something. So my aunt, who had...
Were you speaking, you spoke Spanish largely in the home?
Yeah, we always spoke at home. My mother, every one of us, all 9 of us, she never let us speak English at home. We would speak it, but not around her. And because her whole thing was, how can I ever face my father taking children that don't speak Spanish? Because he lived in Mexico City. And it was like, how can I possibly have children that don't speak Spanish? And even if at school, you would be punished if you spoke Spanish. And they kept, everywhere it was this push to not speak Spanish. My mother was adamant, and so we all learned Spanish, and we learned it fairly well. And actually, I can remember, I must have been 6 or 7, I don't know. She came and she had these books that were part of the literacy program that Cardenas had put in place that were used for literacy in Mexico. And her sister had sent her some, and we would sit there in the kitchen after dinner sometimes, my younger sister and myself, and my mother would teach us, and we'd write words in Spanish. We'd do the literacy program. So yeah, she was determined that we speak. And my father also, he wanted to speak Spanish. So, but my reading wasn't very good. It certainly was not like at university level. That was going to be a problem. But anyway, so my aunt said, yes, send her. And I went, and immediately I told her, well, I want to go to university. And one of my mother's sisters also had wanted to go to university. And she said, yes, go to the university, go to the university. UNAM, that's where you got to go. That's the best place to go. My other aunt, because she was an older woman, very upper class with very strict ideas on how ladies should behave and all that, right? She said, well, no, because a good girl doesn't go to the university. Está la Universidad Femenina, which was new then, and maybe, no, she said, we should go to el Colegio Francés. And I was, oh my gosh, this is terrible. I had gone with nuns already. I knew what that was about.
Yeah.
And I would not go there. I thought, I'm not coming to Mexico City just to go to nuns. That's not going to work. So my younger aunt, my mother's sister, because the older one was my mother's aunt,
Okay.
helped me out. She said, look, I have a friend who works in the office of the rector de la universidad. I'm going to go talk to her.
Wow.
So she did, and I got my transcripts, and we went through this all revalidation process, all those things. And this woman, thanks to her, because she intervened, was able to put me in place so I could register. So I did, and I had gone in January, and school started in March, so I had time to go through this process. Incredibly bureaucratic. And I was a foreign student.
Mm-hmm. So
okay?
More so.
Right. And so that was okay. That was the way I was going to get in. That was fine.
Lots of stamps.
Right. All over the place. But the first thing I had to do was pass a physical. And I always remember the place for the physical was Palma 38, which is a street right downtown, a block away from the Zócalo. So my aunt showed me how to go on. We went on the bus. She went with me to show me how to get there on the bus and how to come back. And we had to be there at 6 a.m. So I took the bus real early in the morning. I went there, and there were like 200 girls standing in line, And there we are, all in line. And there was this redhead, tall redhead, and we happened to be like 2 or 3 people apart in the line. And she started asking questions, and I could tell she didn't speak Spanish very well. So then I spoke to her in English. She said, oh, you speak English. She was registering in the medical school. She was from Los Angeles. Her father was the head of the general hospital in Los Angeles, and she was going to medical school at UNAM. She was for the first time, right? So we kind of got together, and they gave us, it must have been 20 different sheets of paper, kind of color-coded, different colors. That was all these different tests we had to take, right? And so you had to fill them all out. And, I mean, I had been in Mexico City maybe a week, so I could speak Spanish, but, it was like not really knowing things too well. So we kind of struggled through this whole process, and some of the young women there would kind of help us out, but they were just throwing you in. There wasn't much time to help each other. So finally about noon, after being tired, and you couldn't have any breakfast because they had done blood tests, whatever, we're standing in line, and everybody goes into this one room where they close the door right away. Well, it was to test your eyes, they said. So I get to the door, I walk in, and they asked me for a paper, and I couldn't quite get it out fast enough. And the woman got mad. Everyone was tired. And she said, damn it. So, so I handed her my folder, and she went through and picked out the right paper, shoved me in the room. It was totally dark. And so I go sit down in this chair. I finally found the chair, sat down, and the lights go on. And, they're testing your eyes. So he put a big E on there. What is it? E. He put a bigger and bigger and bigger one. And I kept saying E.
Yeah.
Not A. Right?
That's really
So
funny.
then they threw me out, right? So a week later I came to get the results. And I go to the desk, and the woman said, no, you didn't pass the test. I said, oh, which one? So she looked. You can't see, you're blind. And I looked at her, I said, look at me. I said, I'm here. well, it says here you're blind. Oh, I said, I forgot my glasses that day. I was very nearsighted. But then I found out what it was. I realized by that time I had been studying some Spanish, I realized I had said E instead of A. So that almost kept me out. And then she accepted it. It was like this bureaucracy kind of has its way of working. So I got in. And it was, after that, it was just wonderful. I took Spanish. And my Spanish teacher was this wonderful woman. Her name was Vallarta. Well, it turns out her husband was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist who taught at the university. And she, through the American Benjamin Franklin Institute that taught English, they had decided to have a Spanish class for some of the Americans that wanted Spanish. And they had asked her to do it. And so she just loved doing it. But there was only one other person in my class. There were just two of us. It was just wonderful. And so we'd read the newspapers. Lucky. It was a thing of augmenting vocabulary, having confidence in reading. So I was in class with her for about 6 months. Because when I first started classes, there were 80 of us in each classroom. The door would be locked. This was at San Ildefonso. And the building was so incredible. It is so incredible. This colonial building from the 16th century, huge corridors, huge staircases, the murals on the ceilings, and with a great tradition. And these teachers that were just so different to anything I had imagined. Several of them were revolutionaries, Mauricio Magdaleno, for example, in literature. All these great teachers. But you could never ask a question. I mean, they would come in, they'd lecture, and they'd leave. And that was that. And once in a while, there would be one that would kind of be having a coffee at a coffee shop. The Chinos had their coffee shops there. And Mauricio Magdaleno, who was a chain smoker, would be sitting there having his coffee, and we'd sit around. He'd say, venga, vamos a platicar un poco. But other than that, teachers were pretty unapproachable.
And is this the time? They're probably building Ciudad Universitaria.
Yes, they were building.
Right?
They were building Ciudad Universitaria, and so the first ones to go out were Filosofía y Letras.
Okay, so that's why you were at San Ildefonso.
I was at San Ildefonso. Yeah.
Okay.
And so then, I went. I think the year I went, 55, I went to law school. I think that was the first year that they were at Ciudad Universitaria, and the aunt I lived with, Artemisa, even if she had all these rules about what people would say and how you're supposed to behave, she had been a concert pianist. And in the 20s, she had left Mexico and gone to Paris and lived in Paris, and she had played in different places. So she also had a very cosmopolitan side to her. And she kind of knew that young women like to go out and learn. And she had many women friends that were artists and writers. So she had that side as well. So if I stayed within certain limits, I could do a lot of things. And one of the things I learned quickly, like when I had been there a couple of weeks, she took me to her doctor's office because he had two young girls my age. And she asked him, if it would be all right for them to come to the house and have lunch with me, so they would meet me and I would have some friends. And he said, no, have her come to my house. And I walked into that house. It was this wonderful Mexican hospitality that whoever comes, you sit down and eat, and you're a friend before lunch is over, And they're still my dear friends now, 60 years later. And so I learned very quickly, like both of them were at La Normal Superior. And their mother was totally Mexicana. You can't go anywhere without a chaperone. You can't do this. So both of them had novios, and they could go to the movies on Saturday afternoons, but they had to go with a chaperone, that whole thing. But I quickly learned. They'd get out of class at 9 o'clock at night. their novios would be there and take them home. I mean, it was this kind of crazy thing that you had to learn how to maneuver
within those
parameters. We could never, quote, go out on a date, but Mrs. Escobar, that was the mother of my friends, she would have big parties at her house. Her son was a student in medical school. He'd bring all his friends. So we'd have great parties right there at the house, dance all night and the whole thing, have big picnics, things like that as groups.
Mm-hmm.
So this was wonderful. I had never had anything like that in Douglas. I mean, this was like just being in heaven. And one of my friends, Raquel, mi tocaya, she was studying history. Oh, man, so we'd go all over Mexico City, all the churches, all the museums, everywhere, and she would know, and she was researching, and so I'd go with her everywhere. We just had great fun every weekend going to a different church, or sometimes later, it turned out that you'd go to class, and then something would be going on, whatever, and somebody would start, se muere el día. No classes, no class. For some political reason, whatever, anything. And especially before the vacations in May, people would try to make them longer, right? So se muere el día. So if a lot of them got together, there was only one entrance that was open to go into the building. They would close off that entrance, so the teacher would come, he couldn't come in, so they'd leave. So then you'd be upstairs waiting for class, there would be no class. So by 10 o'clock, you'd know there was not going to be another class that day. They'd take off, right? So the first time that happened, I was appalled. I mean, how could you do this? So I went home. I got home at 10:30, and my aunt said, what are you doing here now? I said, se murió el día, there's no class. Oh, she went into a rage. I told you shouldn't go to university. They waste all their time. They don't do anything there. And that's not a place for a good young lady. I'm going to take you over to La Iberoamericana or something. So I said, oh, okay, well, I don't think it'll happen anymore. I said, I kind of talked her out of it. And it would be a lot of trouble to go through that whole thing over again, right? So the next time it happened, I didn't go home. So what do? You're downtown Mexico City. Well, there are all kinds of places to go. And there would be maybe one or two other girls there, and we'd take off. And so I got to know the downtown of Mexico City so well. The best place for coffee, the best place for chocolate. El Prado Hotel had a movie house that started at 11 o'clock in the morning. There were all kinds of things to do downtown. Oh, wow. Just in the Alameda, bookstores, the museums, all kinds of stuff. So I got to know the downtown just beautifully because for 2 years, anytime the day would die, I wouldn't go home.
And what part of the city did your tia Artemisa live in?
She lived 2 blocks away from El Ángel on Reforma.
Oh, yeah,
2 blocks. She lived on Hamburgo.
Okay,
And Hamburgo and Varsovia. There's now a great big hotel there where the house used to be.
Wow.
It was a beautiful house. it was the first time I had a room of my own. I had always shared with my brothers and sisters that, there were so many of us. And here she was a widow with a great big house. I had a room all to myself. Wow. It was just wonderful.
That's kind of in the area of Condesa.
No, it was Colonia Roma.
Roma.
No, Colonia Juárez.
Okay.
It was Juárez, then Roma, then Condesa further up. Yeah. But the Instituto Benjamin Franklin, where I took the Spanish classes, was on Yucatan, which was kind of Condesa. I would walk over there. And so I got to know that part of town really well, too. And then on the other side of Reforma, where the rivers are, was the IFAL, the Instituto Francés, where I took French, because I would take French 3 times a week and Spanish 2 times a week.
And you stayed on there, so
I stayed on there
did your doctorate, right?
Yes, I did. And I did it I was telling you, I had these wonderful Spanish refugee teachers as well, because they were well represented. And my mentor...
Fleeing Franco's government in Spain at that time?
My mentor was Recasensiches. He was a sociologist. I met him the first time in 1955, I had just gone to Ciudad Universitaria. And it was so beautiful out there, these big pepper trees and the big spaces with lawn interspersed with volcanic rock.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'd come out of class about 1 o'clock. We had classes from 7 in the morning to 1. And then I'd stay and go to philosophy classes that started at 4. And so sometimes it was really a hassle to go all the way home and come back. Buses, I had about an hour bus ride. And sometimes you come back for the 4 o'clock, they'd be full, you couldn't get on. So sometimes I would just stay out there. But there weren't any cafeterias those first 2 years. There was nothing out there. And so it was a debate, whether to stay or not stay, whatever. So one day I got out of class at 1, and I was thinking, well, I'm not going home. It's just too much of a hassle. I had a sandwich in my bag, and I was sitting there, and I was reading a book in English. Because I kind of missed reading in English. I loved learning Spanish, but it was kind of fun. And I think there was this novel. It was a real famous novel at that moment by a young French woman. Bonjour Tristesse, I think is the name of it. It was a big thing. All the young people were reading Bonjour Tristesse. And I found an English secondhand one, so I was reading that. And this older man walked by, and he looked, and I wasn't reading, I had put it down on this, and he looked at it. He looked up at me, and he said, "Estás leyendo Bonjour Tristesse?" Pero en inglés, no en francés. So I said, well, lo quise leer en inglés porque prefiero. So then he started talking to me in English. So we sat and talked, and so it turned out that he was a sociologist, and he had just arrived in Mexico. It was his first year because he had been at the UN at the Committee for Minority Rights, or not minority. It had there were all the refugees, and then they were starting to work on the rights of Declaration of Human Rights, and they had been working on that, and they were just putting up bureaucracies around that. This was like still, the formation of the UN was still pretty new. And so he had been there, and he had just arrived in Mexico. And so then he said to me, well, are you taking sociology? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I teach sociology. You should come to my class. And I said, I can't change it. Oh, yes, we can change it. At the university, you could never change classes.
Oh, is that right? Yeah.
Once at that time, the system was that you got it. Oh, let me tell you, registration was a real problem. So I was kind of afraid, but he said he'd do it. I said, okay, so that was fine. So I changed into his class. But let me tell you about registration. When I went to register, I had 2 applications, one for medical school and one for law school, because I couldn't decide which way to go. And I had taken enough science in the early bachelor's part, to do that. So I was standing there in line. The line was huge. And about 5 people before I get to the end of the line, they close. 2 o'clock, boom, come back tomorrow, okay? So the next day you go earlier, right? So we were getting there like at 4 in the morning to get in line. Because otherwise you weren't going to make it. So I got there about 5, so I was down about 100 or whatever. And so then the line for law school was a lot shorter. So I thought, well, I've always liked, that kind of I went over to the law school thing because my chances of getting in were a lot better to get my application.
Wow.
So, things like that happen. The lines were really long. And so I got in, and I also was registered. Then I decided I also wanted to do philosophy after I'd gone a week to classes. introduction to law class was so fascinating that I decided I really wanted to do the philosophy part too. So I took his class, but at that time sociology was taught almost more like philosophy. It was more, it was ideas. It wasn't so much, it was ideas that were supposedly empirical, but it wasn't really empirical.
Yeah.
And so I had a very philosophical approach to sociology. So later on, when I came here and I went back into looking at sociology, I had taken a bunch of sociology, but it was not geared in the same way. I never took demography, for example, or stuff like that. But the law work, the theoretical law work I did was sociological jurisprudence. And so you're supposed to use now empirical work. And so I had to go back, and when I came here and started thinking again, to get in and learn some statistics and stuff that I had not had in my training there, because it was a very different approach.
It was much more quantitative at that here at that time. Is that
well?
right,
It was becoming
so.
Yes, U.S. sociology was becoming very quantitative, and there had been all these critiques that I had learned against quantitative because I had taken a very philosophical.
Yeah.
And see, like Raquel he studied in Berlin. He had studied in Germany, and he had studied with Weber, and you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it was that very classic approach, and it was a wonderful way for me to study.
Yeah.
But the discipline of sociology changed dramatically when I came here. And he was very excited about what was happening here.
He was,
but
yeah.
he hadn't really integrated it into his work. And I don't think he ever did, because basically he was a jurist and it was jurisprudence.
Yeah.
But it was a use of sociological information for looking at law. And I'm so thankful for that, because it gave me a way of looking at my reality that has been really important in my life. That, and the other thing that happened at UNAM, which was really important, was there was a lot of philosophical questioning as ¿qué es lo mexicano? Like I had classes with Sea. Antropología filosófica was his class. And so the question of ¿qué es lo mexicano? ¿Qué es? ¿Quién es el mexicano? Was central. That was an important trend. And that was very helpful in looking at issues of civil rights here and how to educate ethnic groups.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
And so
right.
I used it so much at Pima. That was a base. And together at Pima with Bill Lewis, an African-American theologian who came to teach African American history, together, he had been reading George Lulax and I had been reading Sea and Gauss. And so we were able to really hone in on looking at teaching history in that fashion.
Wow, your students were lucky.
Well, I don't know. We did a lot of experimentation.
Well, that's good too.
Yeah. So
well,
anyway,
can I ask you? So at that moment at UNAM, so this would have been going into the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah,
when you were still there?
I finished in 61.
61. So you're finishing up at UNAM in early 1960s, and that's just before the student movement of the mid to late 1960s. But I can imagine that you're getting some exposure to some Marxist thinking at that moment, and
absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I had a number of teachers that were Marxists all along my career, and as a matter of fact, for example, the class on the history of philosophy, I took with 3 different teachers, and it was totally different each time. I took it with a Marxist, I took it with a Jesuit, and I took it with just a regular historian, right?
Wow, yeah.
And so I was very aware of this way of thinking, which to me, of course, was a revelation. And I sought it out, although Recasensiches was not inclined in that way. He was very much against totalitarianism and very much against the Soviet Union. However, other teachers I had were very knowledgeable on Marxist, and so I read a lot of Marx. And also, politically, UNAM was very important for me because students were really empowered at that time, and it was used in a quite responsible way, I would say, especially in comparison to now. But the big discussions, like in these study groups, right? The big discussion was, well, should we support the PRI or not? Do you change it from within or do you go against it? That was the big thing. Because everyone was very critical of the PRI, but the PRI was all powerful. So if you get into it, you change it from within, but maybe you should not. Maybe you should change it from the outside. And that discussion was constant, and we would have them all the time. And so I got involved in student politics. I wasn't supposed to, because there's an amendment in the Mexican Constitution where if you're a foreigner, you can't get involved in politics.
Yeah, and they take that seriously, I know.
Yeah, and so I had been warned over and over again. But my curiosity was more than my fear. And the first time I remember that I really got involved, that I really opened my eyes, was I was coming home. I was still in school in the Centro, downtown. So the bus I take would go up Reforma. And the American Embassy at that time was on Reforma, not far from El Caballito. And so the bus passed by, and there was a big demonstration in front of the embassy, and I wondered what it was. So the next stop I got off, and I went back to check it out. Well, it was because of Arbenz, Arbenz had been overthrown, and there was this big demonstration. And so I started really looking, and so then I started picking up conversations at the university on that. So I joined in a couple of groups that were really supporting the Arbenz group, right? And so slowly I got involved in university politics. And I remember the first time they had an election for president of the student association. There was the Green Party and the Blue Party. And you'd go to vote, and there would be the candidate for the Green Party standing in front of the box where you put in your vote, and then there would be the one with the blue one, so they all knew how you voted.
Oh my gosh, wow.
So when I got in and I saw that, I walked out. I thought, I'm not going to let anyone know how I vote.
Right, to show your cards.
And so I started getting really involved in different groups, especially when I went to law school. I just found it fascinating. There was a group also that had a Cine Club university-wide at University City. And I had a ticket to those, you got them free. It was like on Thursday nights or something, once a month. And the first one I went to, it was eye-opening. It was the Salt of the Earth film, which was not being shown in this country. It was the first time in my life I had seen a film that had anything to do with the reality that I knew about.
Wow.
And I was just fascinated by it. So after that, I went to all the Marxist Club, Cine Club things. I got very, very involved. And I had to keep that far away from my aunt.
Yeah.
It was something I did, and I didn't tell any of my friends. I mean, my friends at school knew about it, but not my friends outside of school or my family. I would just go. So I did a lot of political work. And I was the representative from our student association to the railroad workers.
There were some big
union.
strikes at that moment going on.
Yeah, big
Railroad strikes,
demonstrations, yeah. And so I was a part of some of those things. We also, they put up the price on the buses from 25 cents to 30. And we decided to do something about it. So that very day, as the bus would drive in to University City, there was a circuit that went around, right? It would come in through philosophy and law and all around, and end up at the station, or the end station. So they'd come and stop at the law school, and we'd take the bus and drive it into the parking lot under the school. And within 2 hours, we had about 30 buses, and by the end of the day, it was causing a big problem. And so the next day, they kept taking buses, but see, the police and the soldiers couldn't go on campus at that time.
Oh, right, because it's autonomous.
It was autonomous, yeah. I say was because
yeah,
it's
exactly,
no longer.
yeah.
And so within 2 days, the price went back to 25 cents. And so we were really happy, but then some of the people got into big trouble. But how I was always kind of really in the background because I had to be so careful.
Yeah, right.
I didn't get caught, but I was really worried for a while.
Yeah.
I was afraid I'd get thrown out. But yeah, so there was a lot of activity. But I always remember a very dear friend, Abelardo Villegas. He was in philosophy. And it was thanks to him and Eduardo Blanquel that I got through because they were just so supportive. I had and a friend, Mercedes Arnal, the four of us, we would just work so hard, and they were so supportive. He always said to me, well, he said, look, the way Mexico is now, if you're with 3 people, you know that one of them is there to spy on you. And that was in the 50s.
Yeah.
So it's not like if things, you know what I mean? Things were burbling all over.
Yeah.
But it was just kind of contained. And the PRI was very, very good at getting people to join them with promises of change. The PRI was an incredible organizer. I mean, they organized it from the very bottom, and they would buy out people. They would find out. And so some of that buyout, it was really effective because people would get something that they needed for their neighborhood, that they needed for their, but it was very much a patron kind of system.
Yeah.
But it worked well enough that they had the votes. I mean, that's why it lasted as long as it did.
Yeah, by that time, 1960s, it would have been in power for almost 40 years already.
And it was very strong. And yet, there were people who disappeared. There were, all those things happened.
Yeah.
But they were very powerful. And so that's why that discussion, do you change it from within or do you attack from without?
Yeah.
And that was a very alive question.
I bet it was. In my work in the Mayo Valley in southern Sonora for my dissertation research, I interviewed a really interesting guy. He runs a museum in where it's in Huatabampo actually, among other things. And he's a school teacher, but he was telling me about the 1950s in that area, and there was a lot happening. They were developing land for agriculture, and there were protests were bubbling up, and people there too disappeared. And he was. It was you could tell it was a very, he was traumatized by that, of course. And, it was a tough moment for a lot of people.
Very
there.
hard.
Yeah.
Very hard. The PRI was very powerful.
Oh my gosh. I mean, right. And then I got to see the way that political patronage worked in terms of water concessions,